It's really a pleasure today to welcome you all and to have the opportunity to host Professor Eric McGlinchey, who's just come back from several weeks in southern Kyrgyzstan. Eric, as most of you know, or all of you know, is an assistant professor of government and politics, or are you associate yet?
I'm up in the fall.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
soon to be, we all assume, because of Eric's extensive and groundbreaking scholarship on political Islam, on regime change in Central Asia, on effects of communication technology. Eric, who everybody I think in the room knows, has been in the D.C. area for the last 5 years since he joined George Mason University. Eric's degree is from Princeton in 2003, and you all know him for his excellent and innovative scholarship on Central Asia. And it's a pleasure to give him the floor today to share his observations on the situation in Kyrgyzstan.
Thanks, Martha. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by a mentor. So it's really a privilege to be here. I remember introducing Martha when I was a postdoc at Stanford, and honestly never thought that
We both go so old.
That's right. That 7 years down the road here we'd be, and talking about a topic like this actually. Let me first. I'll provide an outline of what I'd like to do today. Then I'll step back a second and just give you a quick overview of what the nature of the trip was, and then I'll get into the meat of the conversation. I know that I'm not the only one who's just returned from work in southern Kyrgyzstan. Mark, I know you were just there. Is anyone else recently? I guess, and this applies to everyone actually. Initially, I think we imagined this as a kind of an informal conversation, and I'm more than happy to keep it that way. Should anyone want to add points of clarification, certainly the people who've just been in southern Kyrgyzstan, by all means, please do that. Questions, anything like that, feel free.
But this is on the record, just so people know. So it's informal, but anything you say can go into cyberspace.
Fair, and that's an important point, and certainly will pattern some of the stuff I'll say. To give you a nature of the trip, this was the last bit of field research that was funded by the National Science Foundation project on new information communication technology, and I will talk about that a little bit in the end, the role of new information communication technology in the June events. I was in Kyrgyzstan from July 4th to July 24th. I had planned the trip before the events happened, and had I known the events were going to happen, I would have probably tried to stay much longer than I was there. So unfortunately, I only had about a week in the south and a week in the north. And in the south, I worked made two different trips. The first trip was, intentionally made two different trips. The first trip was expressly to work with the Kyrgyz security services and to get their perspective on the events. And that was only a one-day event. And I worked mainly with the tax police and the customs and someone whom I'm not quite sure who it was. He wasn't invited to our group, but he showed up anyway. I think from the GRU. I think he was from internal military intelligence, but he wasn't invited. And in any event, that was the first trip. The second trip was a trip I made with another American scholar, Amanda Wooden, who's at Bucknell, who many of you probably know. She was interested in looking at the consequence of the events on food production, and she's got some great insights if you're interested in the potential for a food crisis, particularly with the grain issue in Russia and the knock-on effect that might have on Kyrgyzstan. She's a good person to contact. But we were essentially by ourselves, so we didn't have any mediators other than us. The first trip was working especially with Kyrgyz and talking to other people with the Kyrgyz police. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want to pull a. This is on the record. Other scholars have worked, for example, in Andijan with the assistance of the police, and I want to fully acknowledge that the first trip was intentionally with the assistance of the police, and everything that I say about that should be understood in that context. I have no delusions about the information that I garnered from that. Again, the second trip I think was more, people were much more willing to speak freely, I think, with us to the extent that they can with a Western scholar. So what I'd like to do is three things. First, I'd like to simply share with you the narratives that people shared with me while I was in southern Kyrgyzstan, the narratives of the conflict. And there's this four in particular that I'll share. And again, if anyone wants to add to these, certainly feel free to do so. The second thing I'd like to do is provide an assessment of these narratives. What do we make of them? To what extent are they true? What are the implications? How, as academics and policymakers, should we interpret the veracity of these narratives? And then the last thing I'd like to do, and this is actually territory that I normally don't go into, but I will today, is to explore policy implications of this field research. So how can this inform where we go, where we, the United States, where we, being the Kyrgyz political elite, steps in the near and long term? Okay, so the four narratives. Let me just run through the four, and then I'll go into each one in a little bit more detail. And many of these are going to be familiar to you, but some of the added information I provide might be new or different takes. The first one, and I think the one that we see most commonly in the Kyrgyz press, is what I would call the Batyrov and Uzbek autonomy narrative. It's probably the one that we hear the most about, certainly in the Kyrgyz press. The second one is the criminal groups narrative. The third one is the Bakiev Latvian sniper outside forces, Latvian female sniper outside forces narrative. That is Bakiev working with all these outside people. And then the fourth one is the Osh Mayor, the Murzakmatov, Melissa Murzakmatov narrative. So those are the four ones in the trips that I made in Osh, in Jalalabad, and Bazar Korgan that came up again and again and again. And I'll be stylizing them and kind of summarizing and condensing them. But there's a lot of richness to these, and I probably won't do justice to them. But beginning with the Batyrov narrative, and again, most of you are following this as close, if not closer than I am. But it's this idea that the Uzbeks went too far, and the Uzbek political elite went too far. And an acknowledgement that there was a Kyrgyz response to this, and perhaps a disproportionate response, but the Uzbeks brought it upon themselves. So Batyrov's recapturing of the buildings in Jalalabad in mid-May, his rambling and provocative speech on Maison and Osh TV, calling for greater Uzbek rights, and I think most importantly, and it actually hasn't received as much information in the Western press, but I think is perhaps the most important thing in this, is the burning of the Bakiev compound in Tayat. Is it Tayat? Tayat. Tiet. Ударение на первом слоге, да? Tiet, okay. Right outside of Jalalabad. One comment, and probably the comment that will stick with me the most from this trip, simply as a political scientist, was a discussion I had with Bakiev's nephew walking through the compound. They're rebuilding the compound. His nephew's there overseeing it. And his nephew said to me, it would have been one thing if the Kyrgyz had done this to us. But the fact that the Uzbeks did this is unforgivable. And I think the implication of this, at least in my mind, is that the division that we saw among Kyrgyz political elite in April has, to a large extent, been papered over and eclipsed by a new nation-building agenda, that is this Uzbek-Kyrgyz cleavage. And this Batyrov narrative, one, I think it probably is the one that may have the most basis in facts, but two, instrumentally, is the most useful for Kyrgyz political elites in this still inchoate process of nation formation. So this has an instrumental value to the Kyrgyz political elite. It's something that certainly helps the political agenda of nation building. But other things that are connected, adding to this Batyrov narrative and fleshing it out a little bit, it's commonly believed, and here my Kyrgyz security forces come in, that the SOS writings all over the place were, there was the expectation, if not the prior discussion of outside intervention on the part of the Uzbeks. So these were signs to the Uzbek, I don't know who they thought was going to intervene, but this hope that aerial intervention on the part of the Uzbeks, neighboring Uzbeks. There was often reference to flash mobs, and here the information communication technology is coming in here. The security services that I spent the day with in Osh emphasized the fact that this didn't happen only in June, but there was actually a fairly long run-up to the ethnic clashes, and that there were minor skirmishes prior to this, and they were quote-unquote training runs where the Uzbek population was practicing getting together on a very quick notification, so as to be ready for when the big day happened. There were the security services made frequent references to large weapon stores in the Uzbek neighborhoods, so again, this idea that this was premeditated, this attempt at autonomy that Batyrov was talking about in Jalalabad, also in Osh, there's this premeditation, and not only simply a vocal premeditation, but actually arming themselves. And then the jewel in the crown that they showed me during my visit that they wanted me to see was the armored Kamaz. And I guess it was, I think, I'm not quite sure how many there were. It was either 2 or 4 that there were in the city. And they took me to the police compound where this thing was still hanging out, and made the argument that there is no way that the Uzbeks could have built this armored Kamaz in the space of 12 hours when it appeared on the streets after the first initial conflicts from 12 or 24 hours, but rather that this was something that had been done a long time in advance. And again, this was empirical evidence of something that was premeditated. So that's the first narrative, and again, I think from what I've seen, not only from the Kyrgyz security services that I spent the day with, but also later on with ordinary Kyrgyz and indeed NGO leaders who I've worked with for a long time based in the South, there's a fair amount of empirical evidence that people at least believe to support this narrative. I'm not quite sure if this evidence is legitimate, but nevertheless, there is evidence that would seem to support this narrative. The second one, and this one is really, really fuzzy, but I think critically important, is this idea of criminal groups. And Marina very kindly asked the question yesterday. There's a morning event at Carnegie where these criminal groups were referenced, and they're always referenced by particularly ethnic Kyrgyz political elites as being behind what happened in southern Kyrgyzstan. But whenever I've asked for an explanation for who these criminal groups are, I never get a very clear one, and perhaps other folk have gotten a more clear one. Zamir, maybe you can give us a little bit of information. But I've never gotten a clear explanation other than the fact that they're connected to the drug trade, they're connected to weapons trafficking, human trafficking, various kinds of economic resources. But this narrative is, for me, it's interesting in the fact that it doesn't clearly break down along ethnic lines. And instrumentally, it's interesting because it provides an avenue for reconciliation. Again, I don't know about the truth of it. This is just the narrative that's out there. But the argument is that this wasn't Kyrgyz or Uzbeks, but rather criminal gangs that were multi-ethnic that instigated this. And they instigated it because this was a new period of political uncertainty. The old rules of the Bakiyev regime had crumbled, and people were jockeying for assets. And I suppose the kind of the silver lining of this narrative is, if one indeed believes that this is the case, and if this is a narrative that the government can subsequently spin out, it does provide an alternative to the pogrom narrative of ethnic cleansing. I think there's significant reason to dismiss this in part, but there was one incident that gave me considerable pause, and I made a trip to Karasu one day. We went out to Karasu just briefly, and I spoke with the mayor of Karasu, this guy named Rakhimov. Interesting character. Has anybody here met Rakhimov before? He's a big guy, and his primary job even today is that as a wrestling coach. So he's the mayor of Karasu, but his day job is working with young wrestlers in Karasu, and by his estimate, he has trained 5,000 people in the town. And I asked him, well, you're right on the outskirts of Osh. How come there was nothing here? How come there was no violence here? And are your relations with the Kyrgyz police much better than, say, the relations between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz and Osh? And I should also mention that Rakhimov is Uzbek himself. And he said, no, he doesn't do anything with the police. The police are there, but they don't do anything. What happened was he pulled out his 5,000 wrestlers and more or less defended the city. This is a different kind of criminal gang. It's one that we're familiar with from the Russia case. This is really what people like Vadim Volkov talked about in the early 1990s about, how did we get stability, some modicum of stability in the early 1990s in Russia. It was a lot of these criminal sports groups. And here was the mayor of Karasu very candidly saying, this is why we had peace. Now, he may be self-aggrandizing, and this might not be true, but it is an interesting anecdote, and perhaps one that should give us a little bit of pause before outright dismissing this whole criminal groups argument. The third narrative, this idea of the Bakiyev out and outside forces, again, it begins with this idea of instability. And this idea of capturing or fomenting the political instability that the interim government, for various reasons, and I know Martha has a thesis that I actually quite agree with, but in this idea to further hobble the already ineffective interim government through this artificial instigation of these riots. And again, I don't know how much of this is true, but what I would say, and one point that I would draw your attention to with this narrative, is it relies on the fact that the military and the security services are not controlled by the central government. And this is absolutely the case. Or it may be decreasing now in southern Kyrgyzstan, but when I was there and when I spent the day with the Kyrgyz security services, there was no talk of the north. In fact, there's ridiculing of the northern powers. The cooperation, even among the different units, the tax police and the customs, they seem to be completely independent entities. They're completely separate from one another. The guy from the GRU who gave me a very difficult time was not invited into our little group and actually was despised by the other two services that I was traveling around with for essentially being an internal spy and snitch. So all these groups, one, they don't appear to be under the control of the central government, and two, they don't appear to be cooperating with one another even at the local level. Which gives one the impression that this is a situation of what in Africa we would call warlord politics. Local strongmen who have their own armed security services and using them as they would wish. One event, and again, this is all just anecdotal, but that I found particularly disturbing, is before I left, they took me, they escorted me to the airport, and it just so happened that it was one of their birthdays. Mark, I don't know if you sought out beer when you were down in southern Kyrgyzstan, but the stores aren't allowed to sell alcohol. So it's difficult to get alcohol in southern Kyrgyzstan at the present moment. But it wasn't difficult for them to get alcohol, and we went through 3 bottles of vodka in the space of an hour, and this is a group of about 5 people. That would in of itself be uneventful, except for the fact that these guys were on duty at the Osh airport with Kalashnikovs. There's no sense of order right now. I mean, even at the individual level, there's no sense of accountability. There's no discipline within the military. And I think this is something that the Bakiev outside forces, according to this narrative, can take easy advantage of. I touched on the alcohol a little bit. This idea of armed Kyrgyz men under the influence is something one hears a lot in southern Kyrgyzstan when talking about the event. So there was some kind of narcotics that was used, or some of the soldiers were drunk or whatever. So this is actually something that comes up again and again. And again, this is the idea that this was done by outside forces, and they capitalized on this instability and this lack of discipline. The last narrative, relates to the Oshmer milice. Everybody calls them milice down there. The mayor had a plan, a plan to rebuild the city. And it may simply be coincidence, or it may be some kind of causal relationship. I don't know. But if you look at the areas that were burned, these were the areas that, under the new Gen plan for the city, were going to be rebuilt. Cheremushkia, Forkat, the bazaar, every place that was burned, of course, every place where the Uzbeks live and do business. These were the places under the new Gen plan that were supposed to be transformed into some kind of tourist area, some kind of, this is an area of specific natural importance that we have to keep the river clean, so that's why we have to get the bazaar out, whatever. But the idea is he himself instigated this and was responsible for this. So there's a lot of anger, particularly among the Uzbek population, at the mayor for essentially trying to achieve his ambitions through this ethnic conflict. And it's more than simply rebuilding the city. There's also economic resources that are at play. This idea of a Kyrgyz political elite trying to grab the resources of the Uzbek economic elite. So that's the last. That's the last of the 4. What I'd like to do now, actually, were there any other narratives that you guys wanted to add, people who were there? Mark, did I hit him? Or David? Yeah.
Well, I haven't been there recently.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't know whether you would put the Russian narrative in the outside forces one, but
Mm-hmm.
somewhat separate.
Yeah, there was some talk of there was some talk of Russia. There's also some talk of the United States, and actually, I'm glad you asked that, and you in particular, because there's one outside force narrative that didn't come up, which I was shocked that didn't come up. It only came up once in Bazar Kurgan, and that was the Islamist extremist narrative. And you would think that this would be a natural case where people in the population would point to this. And it has come up in the press a little bit, but it's quickly faded away. I think David read that Russia comes in, although it's muddled in which direction Russia comes in, the dissatisfaction with the new government, and therefore kind of trying to undermine the new government after having supported the new government. It gets really muddled. The U.S. comes in a little bit in the same kind of pretense, but what I was shocked was that the Islamist narrative didn't come in. That for me was particularly curious, because of course if this were Uzbekistan, it would have been different. Yeah. I just want to do a quick assessment of these narratives, and partly what I want to say is, now that I've laid them all out, I want to urge you to forget them, and I want to urge you to forget them for a particular reason, and that is, I fear that our attention to micro-causality, that is the immediate events that are thought to have triggered the riots, might divert our attention from the bigger underlying cause of what happened. And I think this is where Martha and I very closely align. I think if there's one punch that I'd like to leave you with, not physical punch, we're talking about riots, so that's perhaps the wrong word, but if there's one idea that I want to leave you with, is that the immediate rush in April to build the formal institutions of democracy, or at least the appearance of the formal institutions of democracy, paradoxically undermined what were effective, informal institutions of autocratic stability, and effective, informal institutions of autocracy. So everything that was holding the country together prior to April 2010, this horse dealing, this bargaining between the center and the regions, this corruption, the exact forces that were holding this country together, the rush on April 7th to immediately disband the parliament, to wash our hands of this old corrupt regime, to not do business with corrupt political elites from the South, is exactly what provided the environment in which this instability could come about in the first place. And we can spend, and I think we should spend, normatively we should spend a lot of time trying to assign blame for the atrocities that were committed, and atrocities were committed. And that's where these narratives become very important. But as academics and particularly as policymakers, when we step back and we're trying to assess why this happened, I think we have to keep our minds on the macro causality. And this didn't happen in 2005. This didn't happen in 2005. And I'm no big fan of Bakiev. I mean, I think he's as bad as all of them. But the one thing that Bakiev did is he passed authoritarianism 101, whereas Rosa Otunbayeva failed authoritarianism 101. And this immediate desire to get rid of the old corrupt people undermined the very mechanisms that were holding this country together, whereas Bakiev realized that he can't just simply disband the parliament and get rid of the existing political elites, but rather he had to do business with the ruling political elites. Atunbayeva's and Baisalov's desire to have clean hands, I think paradoxically led to them having blood on their hands. I mean, if I'm going to be blunt about it. I think that's the central thing I'd like to leave you with as far as a causality for the events. But there are some points about U.S. policy implications that I'd like to briefly touch upon before wrapping up. And this comes, I got a chiding from my dear advisor when I was a postdoc at Stanford, Eugene's advisor as a postdoc, or when Eugene at Stanford as well. I met with Mike McFaul the day I returned from the South, and he was in Bishkek. We had a long conversation, and he very justifiably said to me that your academic analysis is helpful, but as a policymaker, this doesn't leave me anything. This doesn't leave me with anything. I mean, what should I do as a policymaker? And I think Mike's comment is well taken. And I would be remiss if I simply left it at the academic analysis, this idea of causality, and not talked about the implications for the U.S. government or for the international community in general. So a couple things I'd like to emphasize, and not all of these are my ideas. Some of you in the audience will recognize your ideas in here, and I won't name you by name unless you want to be named by name, but in any event, I think they're good ideas. The first one is about the international investigation or the international presence, the OSCE Commission, the investigation, these police forces. Again, normatively, it's a very good thing that we find out who is guilty for what happened and the atrocities that happened and were committed against both sides of the population. But I fear that now might not be the time for the international community to really drive this home and to really pressure the Kyrgyz political elite to do this. And this is me speaking as a realist rather than as a moralist. If you ask any Kyrgyz politician right now whether or not they favor the OSCE presence, even the most liberal democratic are going to say no. It's political suicide at this point if you're an ethnic Kyrgyz to back an international commission. What's up?
But that's not the OSCE, it's a police force.
Well, no, I'm talking about both of them actually. I mean, there's opposition to the police force, and there's also strong opposition to what I would call a real internet. I mean, there's opposition to both.
Right, but the International Commission is not an OSCE at all.
Well, maybe I misspoke. What I mean in general is there's opposition to any effort for oversight of the police. There's also opposition to any effort for substantively getting to the bottom of what happened.
But they're two totally separate issues.
I'm not denying that they are. No, I agree. I'm just saying that this is not the time to probably be pushing either of them hard. Or rather, let me step back and say this is not the time to expect that we will find considerable support among the political elite for this. And I'd be curious to hear your response, Martha, on this point. But I mean, and I had this is based on conversations with because it's on the record. I won't name them, but with people that I worked with a long time who I would consider to be very one pro-Western and two normatively committed to getting to the bottom of what happened and making sure that this doesn't happen again. If you are aspiring to political office at the present moment, it becomes very difficult to be seen to be associated with international oversight, and two, this police force as well. It's just not in your political interest. And one can even make and I heard this, one can make the moral argument that better to step back from this now and then pick up the issue again in October once one is in office. So it's a question of what the desired end may be the same, but the means to that end, the realistic means to getting to that end, by supporting one in the investigation, and two, by openly supporting the police force or the police monitors. This is politically very difficult. This, by the way, was not the position I had before I went. And this is actually the exact opposite of the position I had before I went. I mean, I was very gung-ho on the investigation, and I still am. I mean, I think normatively it's incumbent that we get to the bottom of this. But this is good because I'd like to hear the conversation. I'd like to hear everybody's points on this. Two is about the parliamentary elections. There can be a lot of focus, and there will be a lot of focus on the procedures of the elections. That is, are they transparent? Are there violations? The normal stuff that NDI and IRI, in this case is going to be NDI, typically does in Kyrgyzstan. And I think it's probably worth just acknowledging from the get-go that there are going to be violations, as they always are. Perhaps it makes sense to focus on this to a certain extent. But I think a more important thing to encourage the parties to do at this point, or the elites behind these parties, is to focus on the nature of their platforms. Surely there exists some Uzbek political elites or some Uzbek community leaders who can be reached out to at this point and be brought in within some of these parties. I mean, there has to be. Batyrov, okay, you can't, partly because he's probably, who knows where he is. But surely there are some representatives that you can reach out to. And this is kind of the beauty of the PR system, is you can put them in the party, and then hopefully you can get them into the government, and this can be a way to move beyond the current tensions. But this isn't a focus on procedures. This is a focus on kind of backroom dealings, corrupt practices, economic exchanges. But nonetheless, I think this is important to bring the Uzbek population, or at least elements of the Uzbek population, back in. So some kind of, perhaps not transparent, but nevertheless substantive effort to try to bring in this population that otherwise feels disenfranchised. The last policy implication that I would suggest is returning to this idea of justice and the international investigation. I think after October, we will see a change in the Kyrgyz political elite. I think it is actually in the long-term interest of the Kyrgyz political elite to get to the bottom of what happened. 1990 was never resolved adequately. A lot of people thought that this was part of the instigation for 2010. There are some deep tensions between the two populations. And getting to the bottom of this, I think, in the long run for Kyrgyzstan and actually many Kyrgyz political elites, is in their interest. The trick is finding a framework within which this can be phrased so it becomes abundantly apparent not only to the political elite but to the Kyrgyz society in general that it is in the interest to get to the bottom of this and to get to the bottom of this objectively. I'm not quite sure how that can be done, but I think after October there is a much better chance of doing this. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing anything prior to October, and I think individual groups can continue working. I just think it's somewhat naive to expect a strong degree of support from Kyrgyz politicians prior to October for these kinds of concerted efforts to get to the bottom of what happened. And then the last thing that I would mention, and again, I in part because of the nature of the funder of the research, but two, because I think this is a critically substantive point, there is a fundamental difference between what happened in 1990 and 2010, just as far as narrative construction is concerned. When I spent the day with the Kyrgyz police, they showed me video after video of atrocities. So the nature of technology today is such that everybody has these images on both sides. These images aren't going to disappear. They're there forever. And the degree of animosity and fear this is raised on both sides of the population is intense. And on the Kyrgyz side, the degree of fear and the belief is real. And on the Uzbek side, the fear and the belief is real. And there's no way, even if these narratives are wrong, there's no way to not acknowledge that the fact that people believe these, and to them it is true. So this is going to be a huge roadblock to resolving the situation. But the nature of the world that the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks live in today, and the digital images that get sent around with the press of the send, is going to make this an incredibly difficult challenge, and I think one that we haven't really fully anticipated how difficult it's going to be. And just one specific comment for USAID in particular. Before I left, there was a discussion about using or partnering with the people who have gone through USAID programs in conflict resolution programs, and these group the civil society programs, as the idea that this was a trained group that could be readily deployed to help resolve the situation. Most of the ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks whom I spoke to who were trained by these programs are as shocked, if not more shocked, and believe as strongly, if not more strongly, in the culpability of one or another side than ordinary people. So I'm not quite sure the degree to which these trained people can actually be so readily deployed. I mean, they are as traumatized as everybody else, and right now it's going to be a difficult time to immediately deploy anybody.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you a question or throw out, thinking about your narratives, it seemed to me that there is another narrative, but it's not a narrative about what happened in June. It's a narrative about what's going on in general in Kyrgyzstan. And that's the narrative we encountered in March and then again in May. Diana and I were there both times, which is that, I mean, you could call it a failed state narrative, or flipping it over, a narrative of political crisis that's in transit and not resolved, which sees what's going on in the South as part of, I mean, the Kyrgyz themselves didn't talk about state failure. It's something that we talk about, but they talked about, I mean, in March, people expected something to happen, only maybe we didn't. And in May, people certainly expected stuff to happen because we were in the North when the violence was going on in the South. And it seems that, and in yesterday's conversation, it seems that there's still this narrative. I mean, yesterday we had a video conference in Russian with Kyrgyzstan, with people in Bishkek. For those people who were not here, were not invited, it was a small group to fit into a room, and it was in Russian. But some of the speakers at that, and we still haven't gotten the summary up, obviously, because it was yesterday, talked about, I mean, they gave this sense of the other shoe hasn't dropped. And so in so much of what you said about policy recommendations, it seems we have to put the narrative on the table that the shoe hasn't dropped, and that the shoe is going to continue to drop. At the time of the parliamentary elections, there will be another point of enormous stress right before the elections and when the ballots are counted and when the seats are given, especially if 50% or more of the population vote for parties that don't get in parliament, which is certainly more than possible. It is a plausible alternative. And then again, even if they get through that, then they have to form a government that will get, so the process is very cumbersome, and so that's another point where this shoe may drop. So it may well be that, so that seems to me that has to be out there as a policy thing. And then the next sort of non sequitur to throw in is, I mean, one thing I expected, this sounds like a challenge, and it's not. I mean, you talked about technology, but I mean, Marina and I, you know, especially Marina, in reading hundreds of hours of media every day to do the website.
This is great, by the way. Thank you
you
for doing that.
Thank Marina. She really does it. But the thing is that there's media all over, but there's not necessarily accurate information.
Yeah.
And this is a real clash almost. So, and that's why your point about, to go back to the OSCE and the police mission and the international investigation, which are two different things.
Right, yeah. No, I agree.
I know, but people, no, it's not. It's that in the media, what is being associated with these 52 unarmed policemen who are supposed to be Russian speakers who are proposed to come in, is totally being lost in the rhetoric. I mean, it's like they're all fighting over something that they have no idea what they're even fighting over. And that's true with virtually everything having to do with what's going on in Kyrgyzstan. Nobody knows what's written in the Constitution, including, as Marina pointed out, possibly, those in the government. I mean, they know what's written in it, but people don't use it as a reference document. So at every point, information is really missing. Most people, in talking about the election, it's the topics that are not out there that are often as important as what's out there, which speaks to everybody's twittering, but no one's getting information. This is an election that's going to go on with the old election law, which is an election law that these people who took power objected to because it had so many problems. And yet you find virtually no discussion of that, or no discussion of it to date in the press. So there's this in the midst of technology, there's an enormous information vacuum. And yet people are proceeding as if, they know what's really, people there are proceeding as if they have this high information level.
No, I agree. And that's why several times throughout the first part, part one of the talk, I try to emphasize that whether or not these narratives are true are, to a certain extent, beside the point, because this is what people believe, right? And what I find particularly disturbing about the situation as far as the information communication technology is that the GOLID, right, that they use as this information hunger, need not necessarily exist. In fact, it doesn't exist to as large extent. It's self-imposed. I mean, people are looking for the narratives that they want. And there's nothing stopping from people going to the OSCE website or to going anywhere to finding this information. There's no blocking of this stuff going on. There is not a lot of coverage in the press, which is, I think, a good point to make. And to that extent, it's hard to get objective information from the Kyrgyz press. And this is, I guess, the second point I'd like to make about the information communication technology. Even as a Westerner who occasionally delves into the press, not to the extent that Martha does, but occasionally we'll do stuff for the mass media here in the U.S., I was taken to task for writing things that were unflattering about the interim government and told that I was partially responsible for events that happened. There is a subtle, not even subtle, there's an overt pressure on people, particularly ethnic Kyrgyz journalists, to only report one kind of story. And so I fear that there's extensive self-censorship that's going on. It's incredibly difficult to present, even if one wants to. And this again gets back to the OSCE stuff and the International Commission, which again I agree are separate, and the coverage of it has been abysmal in the press. But even if one wants to objectively cover this, you see this. I mean, I see this in the Facebook stuff. My friends on Facebook who try to do this, they get shot down immediately, and by people that we wouldn't think would be doing the shooting down. So it's incredibly distressing that there is this self-censorship and extreme pressure on people to report one kind of narrative. Even reporters at organizations that are funded not through the Kyrgyz through Kyrgyz sources, but through international sources. So we see this in Azatik and other sources as well. So that's I agree on the technology 100%. But your point about the shoe hasn't dropped. The other shoe hasn't dropped. I mean,
it's another narrative.
But it's also probably empirically true from a political science perspective, and not something that I've necessarily seen certain people within the U.S. government acknowledging to a full extent. and that is there's a bit of a false dichotomy between stability and going forward with these elections, or going kind of full-blown with these elections. And I acknowledge that. At the same time, I think there hasn't been enough of a recognition of the point that you're making, that during the elections there's going to be a great potential for instability. And then post-elections, and that's why I asked the question yesterday about people changing their parties. I mean, there's nothing to say that a PR system with a parliamentary system is going to lead to anything different and anything more viable than what we've seen before. And in the policy formation from certain aspects of the U.S. government, I haven't really seen a rich discussion of this, and that might simply because I sit in Alexandria, and we haven't had electricity for a long time in Alexandria, so it might be going on, but I don't think people have necessarily addressed that to the full extent.
That was really, and then I'll open it, because I know other people have things to say. That was a really interesting point in yesterday's conversation, was that the pro-interim government activists that were there, or journalists, wouldn't even acknowledge factually the difficulties that exist in the type of PR system which they chose, which the question of whether you're replaced if you resign your block, but you can vote for whoever you want, and the assumption is that people are going to shift because there are all these rules about what percentage of vote triggers what kind of action, and if they didn't expect people to vote how they wanted, you wouldn't have all those triggers. It's not the British system. It's, it's a system of very, very loose control, and yet no politician that was pro-government was willing to even imply that that could be the case. I mean, so that's part of the narrative of the interim government is very, very tightly controlled.
Yeah.
I know there are people that wanted to speak and throw in their own impressions. And Zamira, you had asked, you don't want to speak? Okay. And if you could identify yourself, and you have talking to the mic or this, not a...
Camille Caliendo from Department of Energy. Are there any possible lessons to be learned from comparing the situation to what happened in Bosnia when the former Yugoslavia fell apart and peoples who had been living more or less peaceably suddenly started committing atrocities on each other? I will note that, again, as you said, technology has changed, and some equally disgusting things happened in Bosnia, but they didn't get publicized the way these are.
Well, it just so happens that we have someone who from the U.S. government who is both the Kyrgyz desk officer and who has a PhD and a wonderful dissertation on Central Europe and these questions. So I defer.
I don't have a whole lot to add on that. Number one, I am not authorized by the U.S. government to speak on Kyrgyz policy, having been on the Kyrgyzstan desk for 2 weeks and not being an expert on the region. Frank Soline, Department of State, but I am not here to advocate publicly the position of the United States government. This is simply a personal short statement. And again, I don't claim any expertise on Kyrgyzstan, but insofar as the Bosnian example is concerned, just off the top of my head, because I haven't had time in 12-hour days to make that comparison, it strikes me as probably not very comparable. For one thing, you were talking about Milosevic, who had control of the state of Serbia and access to a lot of the resources of the Federation of Yugoslavia that he could deploy in Bosnia proper. Trying to make that analogy to Kyrgyzstan seems to me fairly empty on its legs. So I would be hesitant to go that far. That's not to say there isn't something in the ethnic conflict dynamic that couldn't be compared. But I'm not in a position right now to make that comparison, frankly.
What about in terms of possibilities for these ethnic groups to reconcile in some way?
Again, I'm sorry, I have to beg off. My expertise is more on Romania and Serbia proper. I was tangentially interested in the Bosnian conflict, but I was not there doing any sort of deep analysis of exactly how international assistance and the local elite dynamics within Bosnia getting to Dayton, and in the somewhat stasis that you've seen since then, how that developed and has at least maintained itself. That I can't speak to in any great detail, unfortunately.
There's one thing that I would add is that there's a rich literature on conflict resolution. We have a whole department at George Mason that focuses on this, but and people are very divided about sequencing, about whether you need truth or whether you need justice, and that's all debated. But the one thing that I think everybody comes down on and agrees on is none of this can happen in an environment where there isn't security and stability. So I think that's something that everybody would agree. The first thing that one needs is to have at least a degree of stability and authority and government capacity before this can even be discussed.
Thank you. Janice Helwig with the Helsinki Commission. I have one comment and one question. I think the one thing that's really struck me looking at all this is along the lines of what Martha was talking about, which is the media issues. And one thing I think I would add when you think about sort of policy is what can the U.S., the OSCE, the international community do to get out good information, to counter the lack of good information. And that might actually be a positive role that I think I'd like to see the OSCE play. The question I have is, given what you've talked about the warlords, about the warlordism, about lack of central control, I'd like to hear both your and I think Martha's opinions of the dynamic between the current central government and the mayor of Osh, and what would happen if they tried to get rid of him.
Martha, you want to pick up first, and then I'll add.
I think the dynamic between the government and the mayor of Osh is also between the government and a lot of other forces in the South. It's not simply, I think it's not clear legally. We spent some time last week trying to even figure out if legally they can get rid of him, and it's not clear legally they can, because he's chosen by the parliament, the local parliament. I mean, according to one version of the Constitution, at least. And it's clear that the local government supports him, so it would be a standoff. I mean, it would trigger a standoff between the locality and the center. But for me, the question, and I mean, Eric may feel differently, is it seems to me that, all this rhetoric or narrative of change, which is clearly the narrative of the new authorities there, there's no narrative of reconciliation. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been stressing in my writing, that the international community has to, because they're not doing it on their own, has to push more assertively to not just reconciliation between the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz, but reconciliation between political ins and political outs, because the number of political outs is much greater than the number of political ins. It's not just Bakiev people, but it's a whole host of other people as well. And that's one of the challenges in the South. And then you go to the criminal groups and these strange mayors like the mayor in Karasu, or the quasi-criminal groups, or people that exist in a complicated relationship to law. And then you get to the point where, well, how can you maintain a commitment to transparency and make deals with local power holders, which is, I thought, a really important point that you made about the structures of autocracies that create stability. Because I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why do so many people begin as Democrats and end up as autocrats? Because at a certain point, you come absolutely smash against this question of, how do you reconcile with power holders, people who really have power in their communities, who have very different value systems from pro-Western style democracy, not necessarily pro-participatory. A lot of these people are autocrats in a participatory environment. But there has, in my mind, there has to be some move towards getting people to sit at the table. And that's, Eric's point, I think, was just really important, of moving forward with this very complicated new political system, which is going to create new groups of outs. It's a huge stress on, so I think they're moving the other way. The notion, the narrative, again, is after the election, we will be able to address these things. But after the elections, there can be a whole host of new ujjases, new bad things that have happened that have to be addressed.
I guess the one thing that I would add is even to speak of a central government is difficult right now, and we see this right now between, for example, Salty Baldiyev and Atumbayeva, and I guess Atumbayeva is, in the space of 3 months, moved to where it took Akayev about 3 years to get to, and that is, we thought he was a great Democrat, and perhaps he even wanted to be a great Democrat, and then after about 3 years, the political environment is such that despite one's ambitions and in good intentions, one has to cut these deals. And it took a little while for Akayev to get to that point. It took Atumbayeva a horrible ethnic riot in 3 months to get to that point. And she is cutting these deals now. I mean, and she has no choice but to cut these deals. So, I mean, can you get rid of certain political actors? I think it would be incredibly difficult. I don't think you can, and nor do I necessarily see. I would be interested to hear what Beknazarov's take was on this, for example. I mean, what is even the desire to get rid of someone like Melis, right? I mean, he serves a very important role. One thing I would just add to Martha's point about after the elections, I agree that there's going to be a lot of ujjuses after the elections, but the one thing that might be different is the time frame, the time horizon might be extended a little bit. And that gives you a couple more degrees of freedom. If one has the anticipation that he or she holds office for not the next 3 months, but perhaps a longer duration, then becomes more amenable to doing taking certain steps and actions that might not be in this current situation in his or her immediate interest. So I think there's a greater toleration for things that might be perceived as politically risky.
That's on the part of the government, but for the opposition, it becomes a make or break period. If you are not willing, for those political forces that are not willing to accept this system, if the government, if they don't try to seize control of the political environment at that point in time when irregularities in the election have come forward, or if there is difficulty in forming a cabinet, then they've lost this round, and they may lose for years and years and years. And there are forces out there that may not be ready to lose for years and years and years. So it's a...
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
Can I play a devil's advocate on
the
other shoe dropping? And I think it's quite plausible that we could face another round of violence. But let's just look to see, I mean, a lot of the reasons, it seems, why the violence occurred in June especially, but before, was in response to a kind of defensive response. And you can look at all the different groups that were involved. And I mean, there's an offensive aspect to this too, but those local elites who felt that Uzbek political leaders saw it was their time it was now or never, and would start asserting their power locally. And this was a way to come back at them and keep that from happening. And they saw that perhaps some of the national leaders in Bishkek may have been supporting that, like Batyrov, for example, at least temporarily. So it's possible to analyze all of this violence in terms of as a defensive reaction to other actions that have been taken either in Bishkek or locally. So I'm wondering then if enough people learn their lesson from that it might actually, people might not push as hard in certain ways and bide their time to say, it doesn't, the opportunity to seize power or to consolidate power after the elections may come not during the elections or right after, but there will be time and other opportunities to do that. And so what I'm saying is that a lot of people may be looking at it in that way rather than, the parliamentary elections now or never.
I think we'll see at the time of the elections, but I would urge you to read the statements of various politicians that are being made. I mean, it's not us, it's them in a sense that'll decide what their timing. But I'm not predicting violence necessarily.
I would actually worry that the opposite lesson's been learned, and that is, and we saw this last week, right? I mean, and that is if you don't like something, you get 200 buses or minivans or whatever, and a rich patron from Dubai, and then you do something, right? Or I mean, I think there's a real sense of efficacy, not simply among the political elite, but among the rank and file population. And I would also just urge us to keep in mind that this isn't just simply elites. I mean, this is the masses, and there's this really disturbing book about Hitler's willing executioners. But I mean, I think that the thesis of that book is one that we have to kind of at least think about a little bit in this case, and that there were. In every single case, and Mark, you may have seen the same thing in the neighborhoods that you went to, but the narrative is always the same as far as what actually happened. That is, the APCs came in first, the people with the guns and the looters came in second and third, and then the people burned down the place. And these aren't elites who are burning down the place; these are regular citizens who did this. And so I think I would say there's probably an equal potential that the lesson is the opposite. That is, one can do things and gain assets by taking matters into your own hand.
Yeah, I'm Mark Goldenbaum, USAID. I'd also challenge us to get away from the elite thinking here. I mean, I think legitimacy of the state is very much in play, I mean, particularly when you talk to Uzbek populations in the south. Just to your point, I mean, when you go into those mahallas, they're talking about the beters, they're talking about the burning and the looting, they're talking about the security forces' role in that process. So when they talk about reconciliation, I mean, they're not thinking of citizen to citizen, Uzbek to Kyrgyz reconciliation. They're expecting state to citizen reconciliation. We keep trying to frame this as a legitimate citizen to citizen conflict. There are multiple layers to this conflict, and that state to citizen is critical. I mean, in elections, I didn't talk to any Uzbeks who plan to vote in the elections coming up. You know, they just don't see that their interests are going to be legitimately represented through electoral process. The rules of the game are being questioned right now. And I mean, I think when we talk about housing, for example, you know, there is, despite, and maybe it's unique to the post-Soviet world, but I mean, even though I think they are questioning legitimacy, even though a lot of the Uzbeks believe that they were kind of hit down with state apparatus, there is still an expectation that the state will do something about this and that they will respond. But when we look at what is the response to housing right now, not just the long-term multi-story solutions that everyone's talking about, but where the roof's going to come in the next 80 days before the snow starts falling. You have 75,000 IDPs still that are in southern Kyrgyzstan who are going to have a long, cold winter if we don't kind of get this together. So they're still looking for the state to respond. They're still looking for the international community to respond. So again, I just want us to be thinking about legitimacy as well and not have expectations that democratic kind of mechanisms are the solution to this situation there. Your point of we can put off beyond October kind of this justice issues, I think there has to be some movement on the role of the security forces, and there has to be some exploration of what their role was, who will be held accountable. I mean, the Uzbeks at least have to see that happen, and they have to believe that's going to happen.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, which is, we've seen the UN relief appeal has been met by less than a third, and now the catastrophe in Pakistan is growing every day. What's the likelihood, not on the record, but as an informed observer, that there will be an ability of the international community to respond in its promised fashion, given the building pressures?
Well, I think for the first part of the response, there were there were conflicting visions of what reconstruction should look like among international actors. I think at this point, the resources have been put on the table. There is growing consensus about what needs to be done. But I think now we're talking about local government, kind of bureaucratic dragging on and obstacles that are going to impede this. Rubble removal is still not being allowed in Osh city. People can't clean their compounds, yet alone start to reconstruct. I mean, it pains me to hear that the nephew is able to rebuild the compound in Jalalabad, whereas in Osh, there's nothing that's happening. You can't even take the rubble out. But I think at this point it really is about getting the permission to do that. I think there's there's interest in permanent reconstruction, but there's growing consensus we need kind of a more flexible model that can be delivered in a handful of days to be able to get roofs over their heads for winter. But at this point, it seems to be a local government challenge, and the bigger question is, what will the central government do in order to clear up some of those obstacles? How is that going to play out? Can Bishkek get Osh to do something about it? And if not, I don't think it's an issue for the international community at this point. I think there's a local power dynamic and there's a political process that needs to play out. And until that, it'll be hard to resolve it.
Can I ask a question and make one comment? First, the comment, which is I want to first the international investigation, this question of justice. My point is not that it shouldn't happen. And in fact, that's the whole reason why I went, was to try to begin kind of conveying these narratives and trying to get some element of truth. I guess my point is that to expect that there won't be extraordinarily difficult pushback from the Kyrgyz political elite. There will be, and so I guess we have to be very careful about how this is done. But I'm not saying that Human Rights Watch, individual academics, et cetera, shouldn't be doing this. It's just I think we should dampen our expectations of what the partnership is going to be with the current political elite. My question, though, is the last time I talked to folk like you who actually influence things rather than folk like me who just criticize things, there seemed to be a game of who is going to blink first in a game of chicken with the Kyrgyz government and the $20 million that the United States, and I was a 50 or 20, 20 I guess was the last figure I heard, was going to give to Kyrgyzstan, and that is if Melis and Salty Baldiyev continued to be obdurate about this multi-story housing, that it wasn't going to come. And so is this game of chicken still going on? And if it is still going on, how are we going to get the roofs over people's heads?
Well, I think there are two issues. There is the broader long-term reconstruction plans and the multi-stories. And my understanding is, the United States government seems to be unwilling to invest in that, sending strong messages that resettlement is not an option, that there should be reconstruction on the homes where these Uzbeks have lived. So I think all of the money that the U.S. government has put on the table at the donors conference and whatnot was specifically for reconstruction rather than these new multi-stories. But again, as of yesterday, I think the president on a southern trip actually went to, I think in Bazar Korgan, and saw one of the temporary houses that's been built, a model house that's been constructed, and Salty Baldiyev was there as well. And my understanding was there was still significant difference about what the vision should be moving forward. So again, there continues to be a lot of should we immediately proceed to long-term reconstruction? Is that feasible in terms of, is that just practical to do at this point in the season? Can we do a transitional house? In the meantime, time is ticking. There's 80 days to go. And I think this will be a powerful political issue if there's no resolution and the 75,000 don't have shelters and there are elections in October. This could spell trouble. But again, I think it's more of, it's a political issue domestically now. I think it's more about center versus regional rather than the international community trying to influence. I believe.
Just factually, it's $48.6 million that we promised beyond existing programs at the donors conference on July 27th. There are programs already in train, and I think some already planned. The 48.6, if I have the number right, is additional to that. So it breaks down in a number of ways. I don't have those facts at my fingertips, but you're talking roughly $48 million beyond what has already been committed by the U.S. government. The difficulty with some of the money, as you may know, some of you in the government, is that the money that has been already allocated sits in particular accounts. Some of those have flexibility, many of them do not. So trying to move them is not an easy process. But we are very, very focused, as Mark said, on the shelter issue right now. We have urged that to the government of Kyrgyzstan at every opportunity that there needs to be a decision now. They're aware of it. I think there may be some effort to supply construction materials to some of these families, but I just don't know where the Kyrgyz are on that, and I obviously can't speak for them. But for the United States to continue to provide other assistance, we certainly want to see movement on sheltering these people right now in the 2 months that we have.
Any more questions, comments?
Thanks. Kelly Kivler, National Intelligence Council. I was curious, the situation you described, or the political system, was one of patronage. Bakiev was swept away, Rosa's and the group did a lot of things to break the deals that seemingly some of the regional power brokers had with Bishkek, or at least the agreements they had, and maybe that contributed to some of the events, both in the South, but maybe recently as well with the attempt to get the White House. Do you think the parliamentary elections, will this create another? Will someone be able to come out on top and recreate the patronage system? How does Bishkek ever get sort of the South with the center regional tie-in to work again?
I guess my quick response is I would love to see the patronage system disappear, but I think it's naive to think it's going to go anywhere very quickly. The whole new electoral design makes it a little bit muddled how it's going to overlap with the formal institutions, I mean we're not talking the lists, right? It's
not hard to figure out where it overlaps. I mean,
you go ahead, yeah.
I mean, where it's going to overlap is what you have to do is you have to have a governing coalition, and you have to have a national platform put forward, and the majority has to vote for the government, the prime minister, and the platform. No one's going to have a majority. So when they create the governing fraction, that's when all the deals will get cut in the back room. And some of it will come into the platform, but most of it will just be in the back room. So it's not in any way, shape, or form more transparent than what existed before. It's just a different form of lack of transparency, potentially.
Does it sort of share things out more with the complaints of, say, Bakiev, of the money with Manas or what have you, the fuel?
It really, I mean, it creates the capacity. It makes it hard for one family to be the power broker, but I don't think even under Bakiev a single family had everything. I mean, that's part of why we've seen this in the South, that there was still other people that had it. So you're going to take a pie and slice it up. Whether the pieces that are taken will be better shared between actors is a different question. But whether this will lead to transparent contracts for things there's nothing in this system that ensures that. It just ensures that politics is divided differently. And that's why the key is really going to be the distribution of votes, because keeping the threshold at 5% with that 0.5% distribution
0.05,
yeah, 0.05 required for every oblast in the country, all the 7 districts. That means that there will be lots of people with lots of votes that don't get in Parliament. And if you don't get in Parliament, you have no part of this pie. So it's just taken a deck of cards and shuffled it and distribute the jokers differently.
But this is where this is my point about the formal institution is when you had an executive-dominated government, and your point about him not being completely in control, but the president was more or less the first among, not even equals. I mean, he was Bakiev and Akayev were, they had more power than anyone else in the system.
But it's not clear that they had more power than some of the criminal groups. That's one we just don't know. I mean, their relationship with the people that traded drugs is one that it's not just that this is on the record. No one would ever be able to talk about it. So we don't know the degree to which they were that they had power given to them, that there were areas that they could keep power because there were areas they didn't try to dig too deeply in, and they got tribute from those areas.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that relationship existed, but with a parliamentary system, I mean, there's so much uncertainty about who's going to be in these parties. This 0.05 doesn't really ensure a regional distribution. Where do these elites come from? How do we divvy things up? I mean, Kelly's question about the center-regional relationship, it's not clear to me how those will map onto the formal institutions of the parliament. Whereas before, with a presidential-dominated system and the parliament being more or less an appendage, it was much more of a one principle cutting deals with, granted, very powerful elites in the regions, but that could be done. Whereas if it's going to be a prime minister who himself is dependent on some kind of strange coalition, how does the regional center divide then map? That's what I don't understand.
Have to try to cut deals, and it's not clear how stable those deals will be. And then Now you have the Prime Minister and the head of the Parliament are going to be on the National Security Council, and so to the degree to which security is partly regional based, when they write their national program, they're going to have to cut their deals. And since any human being can change his vote, it will depend upon what the makeup of the coalition is, how long that government will stay. Because there isn't party discipline, your question from yesterday. There is no structure of party discipline written into any of this. That's going to have to evolve, and these parties are not very disciplined to begin with. So yeah, I mean, it's a very fragile system by definition. There were two more.
Gene Mazo, most recently of Stanford. So Eric, I'm going to get back to something you said earlier. So to answer your own question, what in light of your narratives, what should U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan be? In fact, I would ask you, what is U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan today? And then how should it change?
You're asking the wrong person. But it was.
I mean, we're having this talk in Washington, so.
Right. Yeah. No. And this was Mike's question, right? So I mean, we can sit here and spin these analytical stories, but the question is, what at the end? I mean, and I don't think Mike would be averse to me saying this because there's other people at the table when he said this. He said, "Okay, this is fine, but how does this change anything at all of what we do as we move forward towards?" I mean, the date wasn't clear then, but the date's clear now, October 10th. I mean, do I, as a policymaker, change my strategy? Do I not support the elections in the way I want to support the elections? What do I do differently based on your analysis? And at the time, I didn't have a good answer, and I'm not quite sure. And listening to Martha, I'm not quite sure I have a good answer now, at least on some of the points. But I personally think the expectation of cooperation along. I think Mark's point is well taken. We need some kind of investigation, but I think it's naive of us to think that we are going to get significant cooperation on the part of the Kyrgyz political elite at this point. And in fact, I mean, this is a classic Benedict Anderson state building thing that's going on here. This is creating a Kyrgyz nation, and it's not the way we'd like to see it happen. But I think that has to be acknowledged, and not to acknowledge that, and I'm afraid it hasn't been fully acknowledged, could lead to policies that are detrimental. Could very destabilizing policies. For example, getting back to Martha's point, to go full blown into the October elections without this recognition of the immense amount of instability that could emerge with 50% of the population of the political actors who aren't going to be included in this new parliament, is how the United States responds, for example, to that situation is going to be critically important. But that doesn't answer your question well. Yeah. No.
Let me just preface it by saying that about an hour ago, I was at the White House talking to a friend about Central Asia policy, trying to figure out what it was, and I could not figure out from him what our policy is. Maybe he didn't want to tell me, but so I came here thinking, what is the U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan, or rather, what should it be?
The best encapsulation of it was actually here at the Carnegie Endowment, I believe, July 30th by Assistant Secretary Blake. And there is on the Carnegie website, the full transcript. It is the best thorough description I can point you to, and I'm going to shy away from trying to repeat all of it here because of the nuances of it.
Well, Martha, you can repeat it. I mean, you were here for that, right? So what?
No, it's long. I mean, there's two questions. And, stay in Washington longer and come back for the second one. I mean, the first question is, what is U.S. policy? And for that, Assistant Secretary Blake articulated it, and then you can see in the Q&A, there was real question about, is this what U.S. policy should be? Is this a consistent policy? And I think that some of the things you're implying were brought up in that discussion. There are people who feel it's not consistent. There are people who feel it's not coherent.
I've seen those statements, and I agree that it's not coherent, or if you press them further, if it's not a great policy, there isn't a policy, or my own opinion is it's a Russia policy.
But it's a point. I mean, it's like we gather at lunch pretty often and talk about these things. Your points are really important. I'm not trivializing them at all. It's an ongoing debate, and the position you're articulating is one that many people share.
But I just want to add one thing, though. Joe, I just want to say that to even speak of a single policy is also, I think, a little bit misguided. It says we can't speak of a single Kyrgyz central government. If you go talk to DOD, the position is not the position of state. I mean, some people argue that the positions come closer together, but that's not I think what a lot of
Well,
people...
what Blake articulated was really the shared view of the entire U.S. government. I mean, in the 5 points.
He's speaking on the shared view of the U.S. government. He outlined in very brief form the priorities in Central Asia proper and spoke with a focus on Kyrgyzstan thereafter.
But But one of the things that I would say to speak to what you said before I give the mic over is that even though you'd find, if you were at these luncheons all the time, that there's a lot of criticism, you'd find that the criticism varied enormously in the audience. So some of the criticisms would be that it was Russia first, others would be that it lacks inherent cohesion. I mean, there's no shared view of what it should be, even among the critics. No.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation. And I lived in Osh 5 years. I was a director of non-profit organization, research institute. My name is Anara Tabashaliva, and I'm writing about Kyrgyzstan. Recently, I finished a chapter about 2 Kyrgyz revolutions. So first, I have questions, and then one question, and then I have a short comment. So my question to you: what is the optimistic and pessimistic scenario for the spring and summer next year? Because winter is a calm period, calm season for Kyrgyzstan, for Kyrgyz politics. Spring and summer is more active period. So what is your prediction for the 2011? And actually, I wanted to refer to the previous question. I believe and I agree totally that what we can see today in Kyrgyzstan is a combination of inter-ethnic social conflicts and plus geopolitical conflicts. So the situation is very complicated there. And my impression when I interviewed people, and also our people work today in Osh and Jalabad, my impression that part of participants and observers, they actually simplify situation 4 times. First, when they see; second, when they actually try to explain; third time, when they give recommendations; and fourth time, when they act. So that's why I think that this is very important. Interpretations are very important, but what is important more, I think, the stability and to have peace immediately in Kyrgyzstan. I think that it is very important to actually it is very important to discuss conditionality for all participants in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, and beyond, especially for Russia. And the format should be changed. And I think one practical suggestion, for instance, under late archive, in Kyrgyzstan, we had round tables, and donors, of course, inspired and sponsored these round tables, and all participants were invited to discuss. I think this might be restored. And the last recommendation also, there are many recommendations, but I just wanted to mention non-profit organizations. They have their own story, their stories maybe, and interpretations. And I think that would be great if they might be involved in reconstruction process. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot there, and I'll just forgive me if I don't address all of it. But there's 2 things that I'd like to emphasize. I guess one's a point of clarification. When you say geopolitics involved in Kyrgyzstan, what in particular are you referring to?
I refer to Russia, United States, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan.
And what in particular, and what role is this geopolitics having? What does it do? Like when you say Russia, U.S., Kazakhstan, what is it?
You know better than me that Russia is very interested in expelling U.S. base and supporting Sodraжество, political party now. And when I visited Kyrgyzstan, I was just surprised to see a lot of Russian military men. So it's an invisible process. We don't know, and usually press, media, actual people do not mention about that, but it's a visible, strong hand of Russians everywhere, in North and in South. They support certain political parties, and I interviewed leaders of political parties, and I just realized they are parties, they actually strongly supported by Russia. So and again, if you look at our all top politicians, the first trip they usually do to Moscow.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify. I mean, on the geopolitics issue, I think that really the only thing that's holding Kyrgyzstan together right now is geopolitics. The country would if not for the international community, would cease probably to exist, right? I mean, the South can't be held to the North. I mean, it would be absorbed by neighboring states. Of course, we live in a geopolitical situation where that no longer is tolerable, and so it's countries like Russia and the United States that help weak states survive. So I mean, that's kind of my take on the geopolitics. My take on 2011, and I'm no better than anybody else in the room, but just me spinning my wheels is I've argued this before, that Kyrgyzstan is fundamentally different than the other Central Asian countries, in particular Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And there's not a united political elite. There's not a large pro-presidential party. The effect of this is just constant instability. It's very easy to overthrow these governments from a structural perspective, the way, and this is a path-dependent legacy of what happened in the late 80s, early 90s. The elite was fragmented. So, I mean, I anticipate, I'd love to be wrong, but I anticipate continued instability despite the fact that the formal institutions look different. I mean, they looked different briefly under Bakiyev as well, and the Constitution was, the new hoped-for Constitution was dispensed with very quickly. I wouldn't be surprised if something similar happens this time.
Michael Oakes, Helsinki Commission. I'm not going to ask you such a tough question as what our policy is or should be, but I would like to know, could we walk away from this lunch meeting at least knowing what the 5 most important questions are that we have to ask ourselves? And Janice and I work for Congress, so if our bosses come to us, I mean, these people who not only are interested in what's happening in this part of the world, they have to vote on appropriations and things like that. If they ask us, what should we do? I mean, we can make something up, but at least it would be helpful for me to know what are the most important things we have to be thinking about, especially considering, as has been pointed out, we're in the middle of August. The elections are October 10th, and you said it was 80 days until the snow. We don't have a lot of time. What do we have to be thinking about?
Well, first of all, I want to say I invite people who really can affect something rather than me to help answer this question. But the 2 things that stick out in my mind, and that means there's 3 more spots on this list that everybody should be. The first thing that troubles me is when you talk to the people in Congress and you say, this is what we should do and this is how we should engage Kyrgyzstan, whom are we engaging? I mean, I don't know who the partners are. I don't know where that money goes once it leaves. I don't know who the actors are. I don't know who the agents are. When we say we're engaging the country, it's not entirely clear to me whom we are engaging, and I think that's the first question, is how should this assistance be transmitted? We had a thing at the World Bank earlier in July, and this was the primary question that the World Bank had. Who do we work with in this country? And it's not clear, which doesn't help you about what to do in the next 80 days. I think one thing that we could do, and this is I think the one substantive thing I had in July to say to McFall was, there is, and Mark, you probably saw this as well, there's an embarrassing lack of not only international presence in the South, but U.S. presence in the South. I didn't see any U.S. presence and very minimal international presence. We don't have to work with the Kyrgyz government necessarily, or we can kind of bring them in, but there's a lot of low-lying fruit as far as putting roofs over people's heads, having people in the area whom Uzbeks can talk to and share their narratives with, like me, just basic aid that can be provided in the space of the next 80 days that isn't being provided right now. And I don't know why it's being held up, but at least it wasn't there when I was there.
It's coming. You have to realize we are dealing with a government of Kyrgyzstan that still has itself deciding what it wants to do, and I cannot prejudice those discussions. We are certainly willing to provide assistance as we can, and we are trying very hard with the OSCE and a number of other international organizations to get that effort underway. The police, the reconstruction, the stabilization of Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. But insofar as we are trying to work with the Kyrgyzstan, who themselves are the government of Kyrgyzstan, who are figuring out where they want, what they want, and how they're going to do it logistically, that's a matter for them to decide. And it's going to have to continue to be discussed. I wish I had a better answer for you on that. But as I said earlier, we are trying to move fast, particularly on the housing and the shelter and reconstruction situation above all. But there are a number of other fronts that we need to move with the government's consent if they're going to do that. Okay?
Yeah, I think I'll just
Wait just for a second, just to get the mic, please.
Yeah, I mean, on the policy issue, I think the ball is really in Kyrgyzstan's court right now. I mean, I think there are a lot of people here in Washington saying, are we going to be backing a fledgling democratic state, or are we going to be mitigating the potential for future kind of, ethnic issues? I mean, it's really, and there's kind of a wait and see. One of the 5 things to ask right now or to keep in mind, to me, it's state responsiveness. Again, who cares about the narratives? Who cares about how this thing started? I mean, obviously a lot of people do, but the point is that what are they going to do about it right now? And yes, there are a gazillion actors in government, and who is our interlocutor, who's going to take the leadership role, it's yet to be seen. But whether it's housing, whether it's replacing personal documents that have been destroyed, whether it's about enabling economic recovery, you can get your permit at the local office downtown, but is that going to be backed by the mayor's office or the line ministries able of supporting it in the local environments? I mean, someone needs to step up and enable these things to move forward. The state has to respond. There's an opportunity to build, to rebuild, and to move forward, but there has to be some leadership from some pocket of governance, and I think the thing that we have to ask about the next 80 days is, do we see that leadership, and is there something to back?
I really think that's a good place to stop, because I think it really defines the problem that so many of us are trying to bring out. I mean, this really, the question, it comes back, and I think, I'm trying to think of a way to put it, that if we talk about narratives, it's also the narrative of policy making here. It's like there's a spinning of a story. Part of making policy is to spin a story for your bosses, to spin a story for the American public about what's going on. And increasingly, I worry that the policy story is at odds with what is really going on the ground. And I hope, your point, Mark's point about somebody has to take responsibility, I hope that occurs, but I worry in an environment in Kyrgyzstan where the attention now is on the election and where that's going to trump everything, that people's priority, I mean, if people's priority was building a nation, and that's some people's priority, but other people's priority is taking power and using that power for giving them the best of all possible doubts for the better, what they believe if they're in power, that's for the best of their country. But that's still people's priority, and I see these two sets of goals as almost in conflict. And I worry that, to your 5 questions of the 5 points, I worry that even laying out the discussion is not going to be addressing the core issue, that it'll be more important in policy statements to say that we're supporting democratic values, that this is a fledgling democracy, that, then what's going to happen in Kyrgyzstan if people are disenfranchised in the South because they don't have documents, and the government has now backed forward and back about whether you're going to be able to vote without the proper documents, and now it looks like you can't. If there's not housing, if there's election programs that are talking about building high-rises rather than resettling people. So I see it going to be very hard even to get an explanation that will make sense out of Kyrgyzstan for your public, because if you're not steeped in it all day long, it's hard to divide it into things that make sense to people who are not, who have days that are more complicated by other things. So that's one of the things that would concern me. It's like how you get all these different realities together in a way that keeps the place afloat and even gives it a chance for the optimistic scenario to work. Do you have any final comments?
No, I think you've said it well. I mean, I guess my only thing is, Mark, I don't know if we have time to wait for someone in Kyrgyzstan to step up, and I don't fear anybody in Kyrgyzstan is going to step up in the next 80 days.
I thank Eric for coming and sharing with us his observation. I thank you all for being here and for being contributing for discussion. I hope we get to do it again several times before the election in the 80 days that we have left before snow. Thank you very much for coming.